Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. My name is Aomar Boum. I'm a professor of anthropology, history, and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA, a faculty fellow at the Université Internationale de Rabat, and a resident member of the Academy of the Kingdom of Morocco. As the holder of the Maurice Amado Chair in Sephardic Studies, and on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture featuring Professor Aviad Moreno of Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. Dr. Moreno and I will discuss his recent book. I'll show you the cover. Entwined Homelands, Empowered Diasporas, Hispanic Moroccan Jews and their Globalizing Community. The event is part of the Maurice Amado program in Sephardic Studies and the UCLA Moroccan Jewish Studies Initiative. Until a few decades ago, Jewish studies remained a marginal field within Latin American studies. The establishment of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association in 1982 marked an effort to address this gap. Some attributed the invisibility of Jews in Latin American scholarship to their political and social marginality. Recently, the focus of Jewish studies in the region has expanded beyond the Spanish Inquisition to documenting Jewish life across Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, Paraguay, Mexico, and others. Over time, the scholarship shifted from treating Jews as subject of Jewish history to analyzing them as part of Latin America's broader ethnic diversity and globalizing Jewish diaspora. Other scholars would later play a foundational role in the scholarly movement, providing comprehensive surveys of Sephardic communities in Latin America's post-independence. Their work on these Jewish communities mapped their synagogues, cemeteries, schools, and highlighted the region as a hub for East European Jewish, Ottoman Jewish, and Moroccan Jewish histories. Meanwhile, some scholars examined immigration policies, emphasizing its openness to Moroccan, Syrian, and other Jews from the Middle East and the larger North African region, contrasting this with for example, with the United States' more restrictive stance, especially during the interwar period. Despite these foundational contributions, little academic work explores the migratory circuits of Moroccan Jews across Latin America and their connections to North Africa in recent decades. Existing studies often neglect those who remained or engaged in repeated migratory patterns between Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and North America. Professor Moreno's work is a welcomed contribution to this lacuna. In his book, Entwined Homelands, Empowered Diasporas, Dr. Moreno addresses questions of identity and belonging, exploring how Hispanic Moroccan Jews developed layered ties to multiple homelands, including Morocco, the Holy Land, medieval Spain, and Latin America. By examining their transnational networks and hypermobility, Dr. Moreno challenges conventional nation-centric perspective on Moroccan Jewish migration. Dr. Moreno is a senior lecturer at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute, where he leads the Communities and Mobilities Research Hub at the Israeli Center for Israeli Studies. He's a board member of the National Academy for Ladino in Israel and an international member of the Spanish Royal Academy. He's also a member of the editorial advisory committee for Israeli Studies Journal that comes out of Indiana University Press, and a co-chair of the Sephardic Mizrahi Division of the Association of Jewish Studies. Among his notable, in addition to Entwined Homelands, Empowered Diasporas, Dr. Moreno co-edited an anthology that came out in 2021, The Long History of Mizrahim, New Directions in the Study of Jews from Islamic Countries, that came out in Hebrew. His work featured, in addition to this, his work featured at major journals like the Journal of North African Studies, Nations and Nationalism, International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, the European Journal of Jewish Studies, among many others. Professor Moreno, welcome to UCLA, at least virtually.
Thank you.
Before we start our conversation, I would like to thank the center, the L&D center staff, especially Chelsea and David, for all their hard work. And also, I would like to welcome the audience again to this conversation. Let me begin by asking you a general question, if you don't mind. And in a few minutes, what is the main argument of the book? And what are you trying from this book? What are you aiming at teaching and informing general audiences, as well as scholars of Jewish and Sephardic studies?
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank the Levy Center and the Maurice Amado program for hosting this event, and to thank you, Omar, Professor Boum, for reading the book and for agreeing to moderate this session, and also to Chelsea and David for their hard work and technical support. And it's really truly an honor to be here with you and discuss the book. So to answer your question, Omar, the book is among the first to analyze North African Jewish migration and Sephardi migration more broadly, probably, within the frameworks of Spanish colonialism and post-colonialism in the 20th century. And it specifically focuses on the underexplored Spanish-speaking communities of northern Morocco, as you know very well, and perhaps other people here. I'll elaborate a bit later. So you ask what makes this topic fascinating, or how it can appeal to both general audiences and scholars in Jewish and Sephardi studies. Allow me to provide some background to explain my take on this. So, like many Moroccan Jews, the Jews of northern Morocco were expelled from Iberia, the neighboring Iberia Peninsula, at the end of the 15th century. However, unlike their neighbors from southern Morocco, so-called South Morocco, or other parts of Morocco, they maintained a centuries-old cultural connection to Spain, while speaking their specific Judeo-Spanish dialect known as Jaquetia. Now, between 1912 and 1956, most of this region fell under Spanish rule, while the rest of Morocco fell under French rule. So this region presented, according to what I discuss in the book and what I usually say in my conversations and lectures, it presented an unprecedented occurrence in the colonial history, or in the experience of colonial encounters, because the indigenous, so-called indigenous Jewish population spoke a native ethnic language that was very, very similar to the language of the colonizers, the Spaniards, right? They spoke Spanish. And under these specific circumstances, colonialism was often portrayed, and this is something I discuss broadly in the book. It was portrayed by colonial authorities, Spanish intellectuals, but also by community leaders as a rare reencounter, reencuentro between Jews and Spaniards after 400 years. And Spain was often idealized as a revived Jewish fatherland in this account. Now, it doesn't end here. I need some, to elaborate on another factor. In the 19th century, the Jews of this region, the northern part of Morocco, they became pioneers of Moroccan migration altogether, migrating to the Atlantic islands controlled by Portugal and Spain, to South America and various destinations. Now, in these specific destinations where they resettled, Jews were often the only representatives of the Moroccan Jew diaspora at the time, and even today in many places. And this is dissimilar, or it's unlike the more diverse ethno-religious migration from other parts of the Middle region we know about, right? Like Lebanese migration to Brazil, for instance. It was highly diverse. It comprised of Druze and various Muslim minorities, and also Armenians and Christians, other kinds of Christians. So as a result, and this is my point here, this Jewish migration embedded new Latin homelands into the Jewish Sephardi mythology in Morocco. This is something I discuss in the book. And it sometimes resembled Moroccan Aliyah in the sense that it was only, covered, or it was only, for Jews, or only Jews participated in this. But it was also very distinct in many senses. This is something I discuss in the book. So to answer the question very briefly, building on these features and many others, argues that Jewish migration, transnationalism, diaspora, homeland dynamics are more complex than the conventional models we know about. For instance, in migration studies, we know how transnational migrants are typically framed as suspended between two homelands, France and Morocco, for instance. In Israel studies, we know how homeland diaspora relations are sometimes reversed, with Moroccan Jews developing nostalgia for Morocco from Israel, which is considered to be their ancestral land, right? In Jewish studies, transnationalism go beyond this to show multi-layered attachment. But I do something else. By saying multi-layered attachment, I mean, attachment to the place of origin, sometimes cities of origin, for instance, in Poland, the new homeland, the United States, for instance, and mythological centers like Israel, okay? Now, I do something else in the book, and I want to explain very briefly. In my book, transnationalism may be rooted in ties to more than 3 and even 4 homelands, both physical and imagined. And this is, for instance, deeply, the deep attachment to pre-1492 Spain, modern Spain, Israel, alongside nostalgia for Morocco and Latin America.
And we'll get back to that. But we'll get back to that. But allow me to interrupt you here, just to give more context to our listeners here. So you mentioned in part of your answer this uniqueness of this space and of this community in the north that I agree with you. It hasn't been studied a lot, not only by scholars within Morocco and outside Morocco. We have in Morocco, for instance, probably when we have one of the few scholars who deal with this question is Aomar Boum, and even historians and anthropologists who've dealt with this question as part of the German Ayyash school, the Rabat school, they haven't studied the north that in detail. And I agree with you. I think there is an urgency to look at this space and at this region also, and to push against the hegemony of the French school as far as discussing or interpreting and talking about the Jewish communities of the region that was under the French protectorate. Now, if you can give the listeners more background about the factors that led the communities in this region, like Tetuan, Tangier, Larash, Quetta, and Melilla, and all of it, what are the factors that led these communities to migrate to Latin America as early as 1880, all the way to 2 decades, the first 2 decades, or even 3 decades of the 20th century?
Well, actually, the traditional narratives on migration from Morocco dating back to 19th century do cover the migration of the Alliance Israélite Universelle graduates who emigrated to Latin America. We have a bunch of studies in Spanish about this. And in these studies, migration to Latin America, or the Americas altogether, is sometimes attributed to the modernization by the Alliance or other, modernizing project of Jews, meaning that they were basically disengaged from traditional cultural traits in the so-called East, right? They see migration as a process of modernization and not just a symbolic movement from East to West, but like, a marche vers l'Occident, like they're living to the West for good. Now, I like to leave this aspect aside and show how my book complicates this view by discussing the layers of memory of migration and migration from a transnational perspective. What I show in the book, that, contrary to these approaches I just mentioned, is how Morocco became a key homeland in the course of immigration westward, when in places like Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, they established new, sometimes the very first international organizations or diaspora organizations of Moroccan Jews, like the Asociación Israelita de Venezuela in 1930s, or earlier the Congregación Israelita Latina in Buenos Aires in 1891. Now, they created ethnic networks that actually facilitated exclusive Jewish migration from the region. But it was deeply connected to what was happening in Morocco. And I want to further complicate this to show how my thesis explain migration differently. So in chapter 3, I explore how those who remained or stayed put in Morocco, or even returned to Morocco from Latin America, began to imagine Latin American homelands as part of their traditions, and how the transnational connections in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, created memory of this migration in retrospect that actually came to influence those who considered migration later in the 40s and 50s at the midst of post-colonialism. I'll give an example, okay? For instance, many returnees after the Great Repression in the 30s, they built all kinds of monuments to show their success. There was the store, like Kenya, the store from Caracas, that was, it showed the wealth of those who returned. Also synagogues, hostels, all kind of, monuments that showed this financial success. But also they left, I mean, those who came back and wrote about their migration, they left all kind of notes, including personal diaries, even novels. There is a novel published by the Spanish colonial regime about 19th century migration. The author was a returnee from Venezuela, Isaac Benarosh. So, and there were also reports in local newspapers, for instance. I remember a blessing for all Peruvians in Morocco in a Jewish newspaper called Adelante. Obviously, it was aimed at the returnees who were broadly Jewish, right? And they reported about traveling businessmen coming from Latin America back to Morocco, and all kind, of indications about the donations they made. So I show how this influenced the understanding of migration from Latin America, and it was encoded in the culture of the community when they came to, basically engage in migration decision making in the 50s and on. Now, well beyond that, I want to show something. I want to tell you something else about this thesis I've developed in the book, particularly in chapter 3. I show how this connection between Morocco and South America was also cultivated and supported by Spanish colonialism, as I mentioned, because they saw Jews as ultimate agents, Spanish-speaking Jews, that can strengthen the cultural ties between Spain's older and newer colonies. I read in, Angel Pulido's, various writings about how those Jews of the Spanish race, so-called, they need to learn Spanish because that would eventually better the chance of immigrating to Latin America rather than, what they would do with French. And they try to convince the Alliance to teach Spanish while alluding or, referencing the very successful migration to Latin America. So,
Yes, no, I think the point is clear here. But let me get back to the question of materiality and visuals. Yeah. When you look at the book, this is the photo that you have is this is a very striking photograph of the book. And if you don't mind, can you share with us the story behind this? And also talk about, you already mentioned the museums, and you mentioned questions of biographies and people leaving material or holding material document on object that remind them of that past and the meanings of that past, and how also they can perceive the future. Can you say a little bit something about that?
Yeah, so actually I keep on my desk the original picture that was, made its way to the book cover. This is something that as a child, I kept, seeing in a family album. It kept falling off the album for some reason. And it shows, by the way, if you can see this, my grandmother, my grandfather, the infant is my father. He was 3 years old back then, and his aunt, as I mentioned. Now, as a teenager, growing up in Beersheba, by the way, significant Jewish Moroccan hub in Israel, I kept believing that it actually symbolized the authentic way of life in Morocco. This picture I just showed. Now, only while working on my PhD more than 12 years ago, I think, I finally, asked my father about this picture. And he told me something that really, caught me off guard. It struck me. He told me, well, this picture wasn't taken in Morocco. It was taken on our trip to Venezuela from Tangier while we were emigrating, leaving the country in 53. And on the way, they stopped in Spain, waiting for the ship. It was a very hot day. They looked for an ice cream shop, and they entered and they saw a booth with, basically like, it was actually in the Alhambra. And they found, it was like a kind of a souvenir shop or something. And they saw, how they dress people, like tourists, as Andalusian people. They took the picture, put it in the album, and 50 years later, I believe this is, something representative of their lives in Morocco. So, this revelation that it was merely a touristic, experience, even standing or staging, right? It caught me off guard, as I mentioned, and it challenged my long-held views about how Sephardi Mizrahi traditions are reinvented in Israel, but also how they perceive to be, engendered civilization by migration. Usually, the resurgence of Sephardi and Mizrahi traditions in the context of modernization, migration, they have mainly been examined in the post-colonial, post-migration context, right? With very strong emphasis on how migration to Israel affected them, right? They were often, framed in the context of resistance to Zionism, return to Moroccan cultures, and so on and so forth. So at least resistance to the Zionist establishment.
So in this online, along these lines, when you talk about affect, the question of affect and memory, and how also it maintains connectivity and connection to certain spaces. How do you think Sephardic ancestry narrative foster this sense of global connectivity that you talk about and they already laid out? And in terms of also language, what role did Hakatiya play in preserving this distinct identity? Because you're talking about the language, the linguistic map. You don't only have Spanish, Arabic, and Northern in the north, but Hakatiya, and to some extent, then French also comes in with the Alliance Israélite Universelle in 1862.
Sure.
So all of these. So how do you make sense of affect, feelings, emotions, smell, and all towards that past and that heritage, language, and this connectivity that continues to not only to take place in the past, but also, as you say now, by showing that image of your family, continues up to today?
Well, Omar, if you really want me to answer that question, I need at least an hour.
No, it just in a
So
summary.
I'll try to be very brief. So
yeah.
My point here in the book, and I wanna, just focus on a very specific aspect here. One of the innovations in the book is that it examines how practices of tradition reinvention, as I mentioned, travel from one place to another and evolve over time, right? There are layers of tradition reinventions that come to, influence specific communities in specific places. So going back to my story about the image, about the picture from the album, I think it helps me basically recontextualize the Israeli case and explore, it well beyond the story of tradition reinvention vis-a-vis the Zionist establishment or many other things, right? Or vis-a-vis other project of integration and melting pots. So going back to your question about interconnectivity, the global connectivity, our language, specifically Hakitiya, played a role, if I remember. So as I mentioned, it already began in Morocco when most of the community stayed put. They were not on the move. In this context, this sense of interconnectivity I was talking about, it was reinforced by 19th century discourses about cultural and linguistic ties between the Sephardic communities in Spain. It was, I mean, it's well known as the Philo-Sephardi movement, but there are many other manifestations of this. So in regions outside of the region I study, for instance, in the Ottoman Empire, this discourse was merely intellectual, right? Connecting Philo-Sephardi advocates across the region. In northern Morocco, however, and this is where the twist comes, the process was more dialectical, because the Sephardi revival started actually as a process of demise of the tradition, the Judeo-Spanish culture and language. And the growing interaction between, Spanish settlers and Europeans actually, shifted not just the language itself, but even think about names, how important a name can be for your identity. So they re-Hispanized their Hebrew names. Moshe became Moises, or Musa became Moses, Shlomo became Solomon, Yehuda turned into Leon. They engage in all kind of cultural activities, even bullfights, and verbena music, and so on and so forth. I cannot elaborate more.
Yeah.
But my point here, Omar, is that, it was exactly in this context that some enthusiastic individuals in the community thought to salvage Hakitiya, not to actually revitalize it. And they provoked project of nostalgia for Spain, which eventually was really tied to transnational activity. Just one example, and I'll end here. The fascinating case of Zarita Naon was a native of Tangier. She graduated Columbia University in the 1920s, and she returned to Tangier to collect ballad songs in what she described in a dissertation as a language no longer heard. But she went to look for it, right? And she worked with all kinds of, scholars from the United States, from Spain. Her advisor actually was originally from Spain, and represent an whole series of salvage ethnography emerging in Morocco through transnational connection.
Yeah.
If I have a moment, I can give you another very short example. It's even more prominent. José Ben Oliel was professor of philology from Lisbon. He graduated, and he came back, added the Tangier community, and wrote the very first scientific articles about Hakitiya, the language that was in the process of demise. And you see all kind of writing about it in the newspapers and in many other.
I think we have even here a case here in one of the UC systems campuses. I don't know if it's San Jose, or there's a project also of Spanish ballads that were from the Moroccan Hakitiya, actually, I would say from the Moroccan from northern Morocco in the 1970s. I don't remember exactly the scholar, but there was I think you make a good point here. Let me shift gears here and talk about and move to this triangle of multiple homelands that you talk about between Spain, Morocco, the Holy Land, and Latin America, and especially in the post-independence period, and how if you can explain to us, how did the community navigate these different homelands, these multiple homelands, and how their perception of Spain becomes the Sephardic origin, basically, how this perception of Spain would change post-1956.
Yeah. So we're talking about how basically the project that initially started under Spanish colonialism, the revitalizing of Hakitiya, traveled to Israel, Venezuela, Spain, and many other places that you mentioned after the Jews actually began to leave or had left. So,
yes,
they represented these, layers of identity formation already in Morocco, but they formed new shape in new national context across the Hispanic diaspora, as I mentioned. And in Spain specifically, one of the most important moments is toward the death of Franco, the post-Francoist state, which actually worked very hard to rebrand itself as a democracy, and showed all kind of references to the historic. It wanted to rebrand itself as historically tolerant toward both Jews and Muslims, right? The emerging leadership in Spain, starting from this point, predominantly Moroccans, Northern Moroccans, they capitalized on this narrative to smooth their integration into the new Spanish national discourse on this, Spanish Golden Age. But it was completely different than what was, happening under Spanish colonialism, particularly under Franco. They engage in all kind of, ties with various places. Now, keep in mind, this is another very important point, how the context changed. This is a very, complex and unusual process of immigrant nostalgia, because nostalgia typically develops from a distance. When immigrants yearn for their place of origin, if they do it from Morocco, they yearn for Spain from Morocco, you can be considered like a more traditional kind of nostalgia, even if it's after 400 years. But here we see something very different. Immigration to Spain reinforced narratives of nostalgia for Spain, in Spain itself. And you ask about how they navigated all those multiple homelands. So Spain itself began disseminating this narrative to other parts of the diaspora. And it became very, very significant toward the 21st century, partially because of the formation of new institutions like Casa Sepharad Israel, but specifically after Spain's issued the nationality law in 2015. I write about this in the epilogue of my book, how they Spanish, agents working with people from the diaspora, including Venezuela and even people who work for Morocco itself, they became very, engaged in issuing those passports. And I'll give you one very interesting example because I want to talk about the various contexts. So in Venezuela, for instance, as you know, they experienced another exodus. And most of the efforts to preserve the local Moroccan heritage or the Sephardi heritage altogether was led by Moroccan institutions that were engaged in some kind of transnational ties with Spain already from the 70s. And they exchanged ideas, traveling lecturers, and to various, means. Now, in the 21st century, the desire for Spanish citizenship actually promoted or prompts, let's say, Venezuelan Moroccan Jews to reassert their Sephardi identity, to look and search for their, passports. And for many Moroccan Jews, the way to their Sephardi origin came through their Moroccan origins, of course. So we see how the homelands are becoming entwined again in the process of mass migration that is completely detached from the context we initially discussed in the beginning of the book, right? I'm talking about a completely different context of detachment from Venezuela, of mass migration from Venezuela. And yet again, we see a similar process of reattachment to both homelands, Spain and Morocco, in the context of nationalism or seeking national, basically passport.
So I'm gonna shift conversation here to a different direction that you talk about in the book, which has to do with these the transnational organizations. So you have the community on one side, and then you have organizations that are sometimes tend to be official with the key individuals that are sometimes connected to the state establishment in Morocco, from whether in Morocco or in some Latin American countries. Your work is on Venezuela is actually of important here. So if you can tell us a little bit about how did these transnational organizations like the Mabad that you talk about in the beginning of the book shape the identity of Northern Moroccan Jewish communities?
Well, to address your question, I need to provide additional context, okay? Because I haven't discussed Israel yet, and I need to, because Mabat was formed in Israel. Mabat is initials from Mifgash Netanjir in Hebrew, and basically, I deal with it in chapter 7, which focuses on the several thousand, Spanish Moroccan Jews who emigrated to Israel. Now, in this country, we know that there is a broader Moroccan community. Usually, six Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Amazigh, other, Maghrebi Francophone cultural traits. Now, while these cultural divides between Hispanic Moroccan Jews, as I call them, or many other leaders call them, and the so-called Southern Moroccan Jews, Jews from the South, had roots in pre-immigration Morocco. In Israel, something shifts here, and you need to provoke the organization based on this shift. The shift is that Moroccan Jews were stereotyped heavily by by basically the Zionist establishment. Now, in this context, because Spanish-speaking Jews wanted to distance themselves from these stereotypes, or the notion that Moroccan Jews broadly are backwards, okay, as it was commonly held from the 50s on in Israeli, mainstream discourses, they began to show that they belong to a different kind of Morocco. And they, basically went back to Hakitia with its Spanish origins, but also combining its Arabic and Hebrew components to show that they're still Morocco. They're entwined Morocco in Spain again from a very, very different perspective. Now, this is something that needed to be mobilized by organizations, because they were scattered throughout the country. They were scattered, according to my research. They were, I looked at the telephone directory, so I saw there were at least 70 villages, towns, cities where Northern Moroccan Jews were scattered, unlike other, let's say other Moroccans, people who immigrated directly from Morocco in different contexts, because Jews from Northern Morocco tended to immigrate a bit later than those who came directly, or at least many of them immigrated through France, Spain, and Latin America. So we see how they mobilize this diaspora, looking back at their specific traits, while entwining the homeland again to show the difference, or to distance themselves from the larger heritage preservance projects.
Can I interrupt you here, if you don't mind, and then add something here? But how is this different from similar organizations within Israel that emerged in the 60s, that also trying to do the same thing, but through French, through their coming out of the French, especially the Alliance Israélite Universelle? They have not the Mabat. There are other organizations that were doing the same thing, connecting their uniqueness and how different they are from these traditional uncivilized North African Jew from the mountains, but they're connected to the French culture. How is that different?
Yeah. Well, essentially, it's not different. I'm talking about the discourse, the way many of the organizers perceived it, right? And they perceived it as something that does not belong to their, background in many cases. They said, we want to show to the Israeli public, this is how many of the publications indicate, we want to show to the Israeli public that we're not like those Moroccan Jews who celebrate Mimuna in the parks, in the national parks. Now, obviously, it's a kind of, it's very twisted, and it's kind of tradition in reinvention in Israel itself, but it's something that meant quite a lot to the community, not just in Israel itself, but in many other places. And because homelands were entwined in the sense that they were not just, entwined as point of references, but as hubs, people were engaged in, conversations about the, historical ancestry, engaging, in exchanging materials and so on and so forth. They eventually created this kind of unique narrative that traveled from Israel to Venezuela and back again, from Venezuela to Israel and Spain and many other places, including Morocco itself.
So I want to focus. I want to go back. Thank you. I want to go back to the core of one of the things you do in your work in addition to the argument you make in the book, your work is really important as far as our helping us as scholars of North African Jews, Moroccan Jewry, understand the Venezuelan case. So if you can talk to our listeners about what's unique about this community and in relation to, in comparison with other Jewish communities of Moroccan origin in Brazil, for instance, or in Argentina, or in Mexico, what are the commonalities and differences as far as this community, and how their migration and migratory experiences differ from those into Israel and France?
Yeah, maybe I should start from, the last references you made, how it is different than Israel, because this is where the other hub of the most significant hub of the diaspora emerged in Israel. So in Venezuela, first of all, the immigration dates back to the 19th century. And the integration of Moroccan Jews in this country's economy and even political elite was much smoother than many other places because of these, established networks that, well, actually, it's not just the networks that date back to the 19th century and the fact that they already engaged in, building established, institutions from very early period, but also because and this is something that has to do with race, right? They passed as Spaniards in many contexts, in Venezuela specifically, which is different than Argentina. Now, they also...
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, in Venezuela, if I look at it from a more complex way, the blending of Moroccan Jewish and Hispanic elements eventually allowed Moroccan Jews to integrate into the discourse on mestizaje, which is the fusion of African and European culture, which was seen in Venezuela, at least on a face value, as positive, right? And I'll give an example from Isaac Shukron's novel, Rómpase en caso de incendio, which is basically translates into break in case of fire. So in this novel, in which he writes a chapter in Haketia for the Venezuelan reader, not just Jewish Venezuelan reader, but the average Venezuelan reader, he wants to mediate this, blending of languages to the reader. He talks about how the character Daniel Benabal, who was an economist in Venezuelan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, decides to go back to Tangier after he loses his father and wife in an earthquake happening in Caracas in 1967. And one of the ways he explained this to the reader is through a letter the protagonist writes to a friend in New York, saying, well, you think it's funny to you that a Jewish person like me would want to go and live among the Moors, that I want to go back and live in Morocco. You forget that I'm very different than many other Jewish communities you know about. I'm a Sephardi Jew from Venezuela. I'm so African, I'm so Spanish, I'm so Venezuelan, I'm so Caribbean, that the Yiddish speaker in Brooklyn, for instance, would consider me to be heretic.
Yeah.
And I think this is something very characteristic of Venezuela, because the community, unlike Argentina or Brazil, was really predominant in the project of cultural preservation in the country altogether. They issued the very first newspapers. The the Studio Sephardic in Caracas was very prominent in mediating Haketia to the broader Venezuelan community, even Ashkenazim, because for them, as Spanish speakers, it was easier to digest Haketia than Yiddish, right? Because of the similarities between Haketia and Spanish, which they already know as Venezuelans, right? There were all kinds of manifestations which were really interesting. Also, the fact, this is another point of a difference, the fact that Morocco and Venezuela broke ties, the literal ties, over the Sahara affair, exactly. So that puts the Moroccan community in a very awkward situation in which they want to celebrate their Moroccan origins, but they cannot invite anyone. So they invited the ambassador from the Dominican Republic, right? Instead of.
Before I get, this is a very important point, because the politics state politics and global politics in relation to memory. So this is something also we should always, it's at the center of what you're talking about here. So if you allow me because we have two more questions, but I want to have a follow-up to what you just said. And then I want to invite also just the listeners, if you have any questions, please make sure you write them in the Q&A section. So how this community, I think, just to follow up on the question of the Venezuelan community in Moroccan Jewish community in the context of Venezuelan politics, what happened to this community when they start thinking about moving up north, especially to Florida, to the region of Florida?
Yeah.
If you can say something about that.
Very interesting. Yes. So basically, they were moving along with other Venezuelans, millions of Venezuelans, and they began to lose the specificities as Moroccan Jews. They felt much more Venezuelan than anything. That was also true to those who decided to go to Israel or Spain. They declared themselves, or felt as very Latinos, basically Latin Americans. I know this from my, this is a very, biographical thing. I know this from my uncle. I mean, he speaks English on a good level, but most of his day-to-day routine is revolved around Spanish, and he's in contact with Venezuelans. Now, there are specific contexts in which the Moroccans go and reconnect to their Moroccan origins, usually in synagogues. But in Florida, in the Miami-Dade, it's a very, very interesting encounter, because you see Moroccan Jews basically splitting over the language they speak. Those who speak Spanish study together, they sit together, they have their own groups. Those who speak French, either from Montreal or from France, or those who originally came from Morocco and still speak French, they have their own group. Israelis speak Hebrew. Those who were born in the United States speak English. And it's a Moroccan community. It's like a microcosmos of the global diaspora in one room. And the rabbis doesn't know how to, basically, talk to them. He needs to switch between languages.
I think what you're, and this is a point that the students of this topic, I hope they will follow up on this, and more people are invited to think about this. The linguistics part is really fascinating, because I see the same thing in LA when I think about Moroccan Jewish community. You have these different islands, and they're all the memories all vehicled through different languages. Mostly French here remains very strong in the context of LA, but you still have also Hebrew because of all the communities that come in from Israel. You have also Darija, Moroccan, and English. And I'm pretty sure the Venezuelan case, from a comparative perspective, it gives us really an interesting idea about how to think about the Spanish, the Spanish versus protected versus the French protectorate, and how these communities are moving from Venezuela to an Anglophone space, and how that Anglophone space, in a traumatic, because they're dealing with policies and the politics of Venezuela, the politics of what's happening around the world, and they're trying to figure out how to belong and how to live. So I think the point you're raising is really very, very important, and I hope more research is done on this side, on the linguistic side, as a follow-up to what you talked about as far as Hakatiya and Spanish. Now, let me go back to where we started, and I want to ask a question that relates to the book itself and what the book brings. So in what ways does your book, from your perspective, challenges traditional models of Jewish diaspora and illuminate the intersections of colonial, national, and diasporic identities?
Well, let me address it from a very broad perspective. So, in both traditional academic and popular narratives, Jews, Armenians, Greeks are often seen as the archetypal diaspora communities that are characterized by the myth of the return to their ancestral homeland. Now, we know that contemporary histories of all these diasporas, like most other diasporas, reveal much more, significant process of hybridization, creation of course, diaspora divisions, all kind of, networks of solidarity. I can go on, right? We, for instance, the Mizrahi case in Israel, they faced discrimination, but at the same time, there were deemed as part of the Jewish nation. We know about all kind of disparities between so-called diaspora Jews and Israelis. Well, it's not unique to the Jewish case, of course. And what I wanna emphasize that in Entwined Homeland, in the book, I examine how all these hybridization processes, hierarchies between hubs of the diaspora, solidarities, network of solidarities become intertwined and intricately intertwined within a very small organic community that until very recently shared the very same urban space in northern Morocco. We're talking about a few thousand, right? We're talking about a very small, tight-knit kingship network that played, central role in community life in Morocco. And now all of a sudden they have all kind of, organizations here and there, and one organization gives its name to another one, and there are all kind of hierarchies between those who live in Venezuela and those who live in Israel and those who live in Spain, those who stay in Morocco, those who decide to go to Morocco. Now, the book demonstrates how the proliferation of diaspora networks, both synchronically and diachronically, help community leaders in the diaspora, in Morocco, in various places, developed, popularized, border spanning narratives of ancestry in multiple places. And each hub contributed, and this is my contribution to the field, its own story to the broader diaspora. This is one thing that I emphasize, how a homeland can be, or multiple homelands can be points of reference, but also demographic hubs for where all this activity is handled. Now, another very important aspect I want to emphasize is that, the book actually shows, and this is probably the bottom line, that it's never enough to be from a specific place to become a member of a diaspora. You need to, basically act on it. It needs to be shaped through constant interactions between people.
So we have I have one last question, and I can see already we have one question from Neil Schaff. I think I want to ask Neil's question first, because let's go back to my last question. Neil Schaff, president of Sephardic Educational Center, is asking, have you researched the Spanish Moroccans who set out for the rubber trade in South America? As part of our Sephardic Film Festival, we showed a film years ago about the Iquitos in Peru, with a cemetery of Spanish Moroccan names and a community of descendants who the Jews intermarried with and still follow their Spanish heritage, even though not halachically Jewish. Fascinating story.
Yeah, definitely fascinating. Yeah, it's part of chapter 3 in my book. I address this story, and I also show how the Brazilian community treated them. But it's not very developed in the book because there are other works on this, obviously, and I wanted to find my place in this very fascinating research on the Latin American context.
So, but can you say, Aviad, can you say something to the people, people who don't know that much about this story, the rubber industry, the Jews, Moroccan Jews, and their connection to rubber trade? Yeah.
So basically, it dates back to the 19th century when many Moroccan Jews were attracted to work in the rubber industry, basically on the Amazon basin, and they were basically engaging in bringing the rubber back to the port, it's a very interesting phenomenon because many of them, they lost contact with Morocco. They married or intermarried local women. They obviously continued to work on Shabbat. But as Suzanne Miller actually pointed out in one of her really important research on this, they still maintain ties with Morocco on specific occasions. It was very context dependent. So this is something very, very important that we need to remember. All the contextualization that I was talking about, and how ethnicity is something you need to act on, it already started back then in the 19th century. What I do in the book is I show how this specific history of Moroccan Jews came to influence Morocco. And this is the main point of investigation in my book. It's not specifically the immigration itself, but how it is remembered. But it's definitely a fascinating story. Yeah.
Thank you. So I have a question here from Dr. Mghibshi. In what ways did the political climate in Morocco during the 1940s and 1950s influence the decision of Moroccan Jews to leave their homeland for the Americas?
Well, it's a very, very complicated question. I think if you want to understand migration, you know, in a full way, right? You need to also look at the full factors. And I think one of the unique things about this story is that it wasn't just about what was happening in the 40s in Morocco and why it pushed Moroccan Jews out of the country, but also what was happening in the global context, in the post-World War context, in other places. So in the context of my book, I show how actually the political turn of event in Morocco toward the end of the Second World War actually attracted immigrants into Tangier, into the regional places of the regional cities where most Spanish Moroccan Jews were concentrated. And the cities actually expanded. So I'm engaging in studies about, or I'm looking at the dynamics of internal migration more than anything. But I also look at the way this internal migration went on to influence those who decided to go to Venezuela, because Venezuela was searching for laborers after the Second World War. And there were all kind of ways to address this that I look in the book. But I think I mean I don't want to elaborate more, because I think this is a very, very complicated story that will basically keep me going on and on. So
Okay.
we'll stop with this. Yeah.
So let me ask another question related to scholarship in the field. I think I personally, as a Moroccan studying Jews and working on the Jewish history, one of the challenges I found to do this type of research is the complicated linguistic terrain in terms of archives, in terms of languages that we manage, of how to. So at a moment you can have to deal with Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, sometimes Judeo-Berber, Judeo-Amazigh, Spanish, Hakatiya, English, French, in one context. So how do you think, in this work you've done, what kind of lessons can you tell us and we can draw from how to do this work? Because it's also about translation. I can see here Maurice Ben Arouche and all of the work he's done in terms of writing about the community in Spanish and sometimes also in Hebrew. And I for me, one of the few ways that I could access his work and learn about the community is through English. Thank God some of the work was translated into English. So it's I think here language, it enriches the community from what you can tell us about your work, but it also, I personally, and it's not the fault of the community, it's what the scholars and students have to do, learn more languages. It's a problem in these days, because people are stuck in their own world, and access to other languages becomes really difficult. So what kind of advice you would give to a generation of scholars that deal with these in terms of archives, where to look at people who are interested in this very fascinating topic?
Yeah. Well, I'm a historian, but I also, I'm also a photographer. And one of the things I find most fascinating about, the work you're describing, is the fact that people can open up their own archives, personal archives, while you talk to them. I mentioned the picture I found in my father's archive, personal archive. It didn't even know it was an archive, right? When you start talking to people, even with an intention to interview them about your work, you eventually find yourself immersing yourself in a network of preservers of Hakatiya, which is a linguistic trait, but they also provide sources. And I find it most useful to combine this ethnography and historical perspective or historiographical approach to research, because you always end up with unique sources. Now, language is also always an issue, because you can't control the sources you'll find. Sometimes you'll find something in a language you don't know, so you need to seek help. Sometimes you can find professionals who will help you with this, but sometimes if you don't, right? But it doesn't need to block you from following the network and collecting the material and trying to deal with it. Now, I was lucky because most of my sources turned out to be either in French or Spanish.
Yeah. Thank you. So I have one question from Joshua Holstead, and my family mentions my grandfather being involved in the coal industry in Casablanca during the 1940s. Probably this is in the region of the Oriental, probably 1940s, 1950s, until I can't think of any coal industry around Casablanca, definitely in the region of Wajda, until they immigrated to Israel in 1956. This seems to have safeguarded them from layers of discrimination. Can you elaborate on the coal industry as a source of economic and social privilege to Moroccan Jews? Wow. I don't think this is, that probably the rubber industry has probably that. Yeah. So let me ask Joshua, I think probably if you don't mind, I'm gonna speak for Aviad here. You're probably talking about the minefields, the mines in the region of the Oriental, Bukra, Wajda, and Tendrara. This is more related to a project of the French. I've worked on this, that in the 1930s, 1940s. It's also connected to Vichy and to labor camps in that part of the world. That's probably what the story is about. All right. If people don't have any other question, but I'm going to ask the last question, and we're going to wrap it up here. And I think this is a fitting question to close the conversation here. What does the Hispanic Moroccan Jewish experience reveal about global diasporas? And how does the concept of global Hispanophone, deepen our understanding of Jewish migration?
Well, the global Hispanophone, first of all, let me explain what it means. The global Hispanophone is a concept that describes the emergence of Hispanic cultures beyond or outside South and Central America and Spain. And this concept applies not only to Morocco in my book, but also to many other places that you already mentioned: France, Canada, Israel, the United States, in certain parts. Now, the community in Israel, I want to go back to the case we stopped, the last case we stopped in, which, well, itself was very distinct from other Moroccan communities, engaged in a very interesting, community building process by reaching out to all those smaller hubs in the global Hispanophone, where they found Spanish-speaking Moroccan communities who were not organized enough. They reached out to France, and they managed to establish an organization called Mabat France. Sorry. In Canada, they did something similar. In the United States and other places. And eventually, they encouraged these communities to form their organizations because it served them. That was a strategic move. It served them in Israel in strengthening their influence within the country and showing that they have more strength than they have locally. This is the formation of a global community. This is why the title of the book is Entwined Homelands, Empower Diasporas. They empowered themselves by doing this. Now, there is another side to the coin, because in the non-Israeli communities that I refer to, people basically sought a way to maintain their ties both to the Spanish-speaking Moroccan fellows, who were most likely scattered around. They were not, living together in most places. But also they searched connections to Israel. So what Mabat was offering was really, entwining both of their identities together. So they went to Israel, they went to conferences that Mabat organized in Israel. And of course, I'm going back again to the main point, for this to happen, you need mobilizers. You need people who are willing to craft and promote the narratives about ancestry and organize all those conferences that will eventually bring together the individuals who want to, dwell on their identity and meet other people. I hope that answered the questions.
Thank you, Aviad. Thank you, everyone, for coming and being here. Before we end, I would like to thank again Chelsea and David and Viv and the rest of the staff of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And please visit the website of the center. A little more programming coming. We will have more series coming in the winter. In the lecture, actually, we have Aomar Boum here. He will be here next January talking about the Jewish community of Sweta and Melilla and Tetwan, and we'll keep continuing to do more work and lectures about the Sephardic community, not only in the Mediterranean but globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you, everyone.